Hello, Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, if there's anything from Tuesday's election that is already uniting people, it is that just about everyone agrees that the results were a shock. We'll look at the impact that the outcome could have on Louisiana. We'll also examine the Senate runoff, David Duke's last hurrah, and other key campaigns. On the ballot for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Jeremy Alford, publisher, LaPolitics.com. Tyler Bridges, political reporter, The New Orleans Advocate, and Stephanie Grace, columnist, The New Orleans Advocate. And we go to Stephanie first. And it certainly was a stunning finish to a very, very, very long election cycle.
Yes.
So what will this finish of President-elect Trump? What kind of impact is that going to have on Louisiana?
Well, for one thing, we are a supportive state, so he will like that, I think. But the thing to watch really is then who in Louisiana maybe has an in with him and what policies might affect Louisiana. One person I would definitely watch would be Steve Scalise, the congressman from Metairie, who's the number 3 ranking Republican in the House. And I think is very well positioned to be a point person in some ways for Trump for a couple of reasons. One is he was with Trump, not way back during the primaries, but once he was with Trump, he was with him, unlike Paul Ryan, where, as we know, there was a very dramatic back and forth often, and it's unclear how they're going to do. They're talking like they'll do fine now, but we don't know. Scalise is, he's really going to be the main player in the Louisiana delegation now that David Vitter is leaving, and Charles Boustany and John Fleming, who both lost their attempt to go to the Senate, are leaving.
There's no seniority anymore.
None at all. We're going to have a very junior delegation, both in the House and the Senate. But Scalise is a power player, and he also has a relationship with Mike Pence, which is interesting, the vice president elect, who worked with him in the House and actually had preceded him as head of something called the Republican Study Committee, which is a big caucus of House conservatives. They've spoken already, apparently. They've spoken about deregulation. Scalise is really excited to kind of get in there. Some other people to watch. Maybe Bobby Jindal, we don't know, but there is a report that the transition team might be looking at him for a possible cabinet or maybe sub-cabinet post, which is interesting because Jindal, of course, said very, very harsh things when he was running against Trump and then turned around and endorsed him, as many other people on the list did. Other things to watch for. What happens with the Affordable Care Act is going to be very interesting. Of course, Donald Trump talked about getting rid of it immediately, and the Republicans in Congress have been voting to repeal it repeatedly, knowing that it would never be repealed as long as a Democrat was in the White House, certainly not President Obama, whose signature law it is, and not Hillary Clinton. So it's very easy to say, voting to repeal. But now that the president wants to do it, Congress really has to come up with a replacement. They, repeal and replace is the phrase, but there hasn't been a replacement bill that the Republicans have kind of centered on, and they've had 6 years to work on this. And I think that's because it's very complicated, and there are going to be winners and losers, and if you actually do repeal it, you're going to end up taking benefits away from a lot of people that are very popular. I mean, they really want to tackle the unpopular parts like the mandate and the high premiums on the individual exchange, but Medicaid expansion. I mean, we have over 300,000 new Medicaid
around
patients.
330, 340,000, and the state's revised its projections to almost be 400,000 by next year.
And it is also, the budgets of those state public-private partnerships are built on this. There are a lot of dominoes.
The state budget is balanced on that Medicaid money.
Exactly,
right?
And so if it goes away, I mean, it's going to be a serious issue. It would also be a serious issue for people who the lifetime benefit provision, the very popular things when you ask, even though Obamacare polls negatively, individual provisions are very popular. One is that there's no more lifetime cap on how much, if you have cancer, that, your insurance company can't cut you off once you've spent a lot of money. That could go away.
And you can't be denied coverage for
pre-existing conditions. So it's really going to be interesting to see if they are able to move on that quickly and how that affects the entire industry has reoriented itself around this law.
There's also a new federal law on overtime, which was designed to help waiters, but it applies to everybody, goes into effect December 1st, and is very, very unpopular. And just from speaking for myself, I'm involved in a small business. People having to make rules to deal with a problem that doesn't exist. But there's just got to be pros anyway, and so that's...
Right. I mean, some of the wage earners might think it exists, but that will probably go away too. And then something else to watch, when President-elect Trump came out on election night, he didn't talk about the building the wall. He didn't talk about a lot of the more divisive things he campaigned on. He said, we're going to have a great big infrastructure program and create jobs. Great. You know who's been saying that? The Democrats. Yeah. And you know who jumped on it right away? John Bel Edwards, who said, that sounds great. We have a lot of infrastructure needs here. The problem is his Republican allies, including a lot of our representatives, have been very reluctant to fund that. That's very expensive in Congress. So then the question becomes, does Congress give him the money to do this thing?
And of course, both chambers, both House and Senate, are Republican now.
Yeah.
You know, the majority are Republican,
right.
with a Republican now in the White House. So it will be interesting to see.
So you can't just talk. You really have to, step up and do it at this point.
It's also
go ahead, Errol.
interesting to speculate on people who might have been had it gone the other way. If Hillary Clinton had won, I think one person people would certainly have kept an eye on would have been Mitch Landrieu, who seemed like prime material for a cabinet position.
And then the dominoes there if he left.
Yeah, his dad was Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and certainly Mitch Landrieu was qualified to deal with that.
And he was out campaigning for her. I mean, he was, as was Cedric Richmond, so he would have been a big power player. Something to watch there. I mean, a lot up in the air, the U.S. Attorney, the federal judges, it looked like probably Cedric Richmond was going to have a heavy hand in those. Now it's the local Republicans, and there's a lot of jockeying for those. There are 2 openings in New Orleans on the bench, and then the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Okay, as we have said, the result of the presidential race was really pretty much a shock. It surprised a lot of people. What about here, locally, though, for the Louisiana Senate race? It sort of turned out to be as expected?
I think it did. I think the conventional wisdom early on was that we would see Foster Campbell and John Kennedy, and it was a product of our jungle primary system where we were seeing 2 different ends of the political spectrum. But there's, even though the results are in for that race, I think there's still some questions of the other names that are on the ballot. We're losing 2 congressmen, like Stephanie says, so we're going to see what happens with John Fleming and Charles Bustani. David Duke, which I know we'll get into later, and there's questions about if this is the end for him. But moving forward, I think a lot of folks look at this race and think that it is leaning heavily Republican. That a Republican will maintain that seat, which would mean John Kennedy. There wasn't a whole lot of money in this race to begin with compared to the last 2 cycles, so it's going to be interesting to see if either candidate manages to make any kind of noise to grab voters' attention, because turnout is going to drop significantly for the December runoff.
I'll tell you the numbers that jumped out at me were that for both President and the Senate, on Tuesday, whites in Louisiana, 80% in favor of the Republicans. Democrats only got 16% of the white vote in this state.
So in looking at this race for the Senate, John Bel Edwards has come out in support of Foster Campbell, but how active is he going to be?
Well, he's been very active already. He's helped him raise money. He's appeared in ads, and Foster Campbell, I'm sure, is going to want to lean on him throughout this race, but he's really going to have to find a path to victory and be able to show donors what that path is, and that path is going to have to be believable. He could run into some walls in terms of fundraising moving forward, but the governor is not only involved in that race, but he's also endorsed Marshall Jones up in the 4th District, and he also endorsed Mary Werner for the Public Service Commission, and that race ended on Tuesday without a runoff.
Okay, now
with the Republican,
with
former
Mike,
state party chair,
Mike Francis winning that race.
And the question for John Bel Edwards is, how much political capital does he want to invest in a race that probably will not turn out well, because the more he invests, if it doesn't go well, the bigger cost for him politically.
Jeremy, looking back at the Senate campaign, how important, I know they were very important, but were the PACs? I know, for example, the case of John Kennedy's campaign going after Bustani, and that's a part of the campaign behind the scenes that we don't see, but people should be aware of that.
Yeah, and last year in the governor's race, we saw these kind of stateside PACs that were created specifically for the governor's race. But the PAC that you're referring to, the ESA Fund, which was a pro-Kennedy super PAC, was actually a national super PAC that David Vitter's former political architect, Kyle Ruckert, was associated with. He didn't run it. He wasn't in charge of it, but he was the general consultant in Louisiana for it. and they really did go after Boustany. And out of all the super PACs, they probably made the biggest splash. And they almost focused exclusively on Boustany in the final week, and I think they took a couple of hits on Fleming, but that probably kept Boustany out of the runoff at the end of the day, and he performed a lot stronger.
You know what, Jeremy, it reminds me of is in last year's governor's race where the pro-Vitter PAC was playing, you remember the phrase, Joe DeGrotto, the whack-a-mole.
Whack-a-mole
exactly.
on a balance beam is what he said.
And so he was going after, they were going
when
after
one
at
goes
times.
up, you hit them. When the other goes up, you hit them.
Exactly. So last year was Angel and Darden, and I think your point, which is really interesting, is that they hit Boustany at the end harder. That was the mole who was beginning to threaten
And if you watched
Kennedy.
on election night, the results coming in, I mean, for a long time, Boustany was in that second spot. We could have had a 2 Republican runoff, which would have been a very different race. What happened was, at first Lafayette, which is his home parish, was still out, and then that came in and he was in good shape, but then, some of those lagging precincts were in New Orleans and Baton Rouge, where you have a lot of Democratic voters, so that, at the end, pushed Foster Campbell
and
up.
I mean, looking at these numbers, and this is from the Advocate, from a bright young journalist, Tyler Bridges. But I mean, the candidates underneath Kennedy were all just a couple of points apart. Campbell 17, Boustany 15, Fayard 12, Fleming 10. I mean, they all ran pretty close to each
and
other.
And Kennedy himself had 25.
Yeah.
So.
Well, of course, you two have you, Jeremy and Tyler, have just authored a book about the governor's race last year, which is called.
It's called Long Shot, and I hear it's really, really good.
I hear it's really good too, and
I haven't read it yet.
And it's just about on the market too, just in time for the holidays. But real quick, it was sort of stunning for John Bell Edwards, a Democrat, to win the governorship, and he is now putting his support, as you said, behind Foster Campbell. Will that be repeated? Do you think? Any chance?
I had an hour-long interview with the governor last week, and I asked him if he was going to continue to get involved in races and to kind of roll the dice and see. We talked about. That it could result in his coattails either shrinking or growing longer. And he told me that he doesn't intend to get into many elections. If you really peel back the layers on the people that he did endorse this cycle, they're either people he owed favors to or they're connected to people that, that supported his campaign
But
for
by the
governor.
time of that gubernatorial runoff last year, there was so much baggage on David Vitter. I mean, he was being hit left and right, just all kind of things, and John Kennedy doesn't have that sort of baggage, and so there was a lot to go after Vitter on.
Yeah, and I mean, we're gonna have to see how hard they want to go after Kennedy. I mean, there are things out there that have been brought up in the past, and we're gonna remember that. It's funny that both John Kennedy and Foster Campbell, these are two guys who have spent a lifetime in Louisiana politics, and they're both running as outsiders. Yeah.
Okay, runoff December 10th. Is that correct? Okay.
Correct.
All right, over to Tyler right now. And you wrote a piece for Politico about this being what you saw as David Duke's last hurrah in this race.
Yeah, well, I've been covering him since 1989 when I was with the Times-Picayune, and didn't really pay a lot of attention to him throughout much of this year's Senate election. Just he wasn't even doing very much. The most campaigning he was doing was going to gun shows on weekends.
And tweeting.
And he had a daily radio show, but it wasn't really launched, or it wasn't really aimed at a Louisiana audience. And but I think what finally put him on the map in the Senate race was the Raycom poll that put him at just barely above the 5% threshold to qualify for that debate at Dillard last week. And all of a sudden he was in the news again. In fact, I think he probably got more attention during that campaign, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, from national media in this race, from Louisiana media.
Absolutely.
But I just, he didn't raise much money. I covered him during the Senate race in 1990 and then in the governor's race of 91. And I went to lots of big rallies he had where people were, it reminded me in fact of Trump rallies where people were so fired up for him, and they gave him $5, $20 in cash. He raised a lot of money, did very compelling TV ads, and all of that was absent this year. So when I wrote this piece last week for Political Weekly, I made the estimation that he was not going to do well, and in fact, on election night, he got 3%, finished in 7th place. Stephanie actually corrected me. I did a tweet said he had finished 6th, and she corrected me. He finished 7th.
Rob Maness snuck in there.
Rob Maness performed better than David Duke and didn't get a single televised debate invitation.
So you do see this as the last hurrah? I mean, you don't see that he's going to throw his hat into the ring for any other sort of local political contest, state or anything
I guess
like
he could
that?
run for the state house, but he's 66 years old. I just don't have the sense that he has the stomach for the abuse that he gets out there anymore. He is just, he suffered a lifetime of abuse by people just telling him all sorts of terrible things, and probably most people think it was justified what he was told. He just really didn't campaign very much this year. So I just, he's 66 years old. I think whatever campaigning he's going to be doing is via Twitter and his Facebook and his website.
So, go ahead, Errol.
No, but if you think about the debate that Duke qualified because he was polling 5.1%, and Manus didn't get in because he didn't hit 5%. Right. But if you look at the final results,
he did get the 5%.
That Manus outdid Duke. So I'm sure that's crossed his mind. In terms of who should be on the TV debate.
I think David Duke's vote would have probably went to Rob Manus. And had Duke not been in this race, Rob Manus would have been a contender.
Maybe, yeah.
That's another question too: is what happens to Rob Manus?
Right.
Mm-hmm. I think he wants to go to Washington.
You reported that. One thing about Duke, though, is so he on election day he was acting very triumphant. Again, he's been on Twitter a lot and saying, "Donald Trump, we did that." He's really still trying to claim that kind of his voice helped lift Donald Trump, I think we might still be hearing that.
I tell you, I covered Duke during his heyday 25 years ago, and the things he was talking about are a lot of the same things that Donald Trump is talking about today, and the message of send them a message and to Washington and to the political elite and the political establishment, it just resonates so much with what Trump is doing today.
It really
and
does.
Remember, back then there was a lot of economic dislocation, and white voters were feeling very frustrated in Louisiana after the oil bust. And I think we're seeing the same thing nationally, just a sense that let's vote for the guy who's going to shake things up.
Okay, all right, Tyler, thanks a lot. I'm going to go over to Errol right now, and there was a local race for mayor in Kenner. Yeah,
just want to add that at any time in politics, there's always a group that feels left out. Because someone's built his political base by going after this group. When you do that, you're leaving these people out, and so they're frustrated. So it's always there. That dynamic is part of politics. Kenner finally, just because the law was able to get around the business of selecting a replacement for Mike Guinea, who was elected a year ago. They've had an interim mayor, but the primary was Tuesday. And Ben Zahn, who's a former council member in Kenner and who's a Jefferson Parish council member, led with 49% of the vote. Greg Carroll, who's a council member, and it's relevant to the story, he was the lone Democrat and the lone black candidate, had 22% of the vote and finished second. That breakdown is almost exactly the same as the black-white demographics of Kenner. Kenner is 50% white, it's like 22% black and 23% Hispanic, and so it followed that pattern. Not that I don't think race was an issue per se. I mean, the things they talked about, Carroll wanted to develop more of a tourist industry in Kenner, wanted the city to have its own department, and Zahn wanted to do more infrastructure improvement, and so it was really a civic sort of campaign. But when you get into runoff, and one candidate had 49% of the vote, and you're the other candidate, you probably just want to think about it. I mean, if you want to go through all this, because it's really kind of hard to turn that around. But Kenner is the largest city in Jefferson Parish. And so that position of being mayor in Kenner has always historically been a real stepping stone in Jefferson Parish politics.
Well, wait a second, a stepping stone to what? If you think about Aaron Broussard and what Mike Jenny is today.
Well, it's been a stepping stone to parish president for one thing, okay? Because Joe Yenny was mayor of Kenner. Aaron Broussard, that's a prestigious job. And then the current Mike Yenny, and so there's three examples of a mayor of Kenner. I mean, that's the population base in the area, and so if you're popular, it's really a good place to build something. I mean, in this particular case, it's been parish president, but it could be if there's a vacancy in the congressional seat. It's a good political position to have.
So facing a runoff also December 10th,
right?
Okay. Thanks a lot, Errol. And there were other elections, too, that we wanted to touch on. First, the congressional races. Jeremy, why don't you kick that
So
off?
in the 4th Congressional District up in northwest Louisiana, we've got a runoff between State Representative Mike Johnson, who has crafted a political brand pretty quickly on the back of religious liberty issues. He's going to be in the runoff against Marshall Jones, who's been endorsed by the unions and the governor. He was a lone Democrat in that race. He had absolutely nothing on TV, nothing on radio, didn't appear at any of the forums. He kind of phoned it in during the primary and snuck into the runoff just by being the lone Democrat. And Mike Johnson benefited at the last minute from some national conservative groups that came in, spent some money on TV for him, and also helped with his GOTV operations on Tuesday. It's going to be important for Mike Johnson to have those folks stick around and help him out. In the 3rd Congressional District, which is a really interesting race, Scott Angel, who ran a close third for governor, made the runoff as expected, and he will be facing the Cajun John Wayne, Clay Higgins.
Wasn't that outcome maybe closer than what most people expected?
It was much closer than anyone expected, including probably Scott Angel. Scott Angel performed worse in each parish in the 3rd District than he did for governor last year. He got 40% in his home parish of St. Martin. Wow. I would argue that Scott Angel over his lifetime has probably been in more than 40% of the homes in St. Martin Parish.
And was he parish president there, or he was a local official there before?
He was the first after home rule charter.
Okay, so I got to move you along. Supreme Court.
Supreme Court is Judge Jimmy Genovese. Got 51% of the vote and will be Louisiana's next Supreme Court justice.
Okay, and we had some amendments to talk about too. Who wants to tackle that one?
Jump ball. There were 6 constitutional amendments. Some passed, some failed. That often happens. The big ones, the most closely watched one was a no vote, by a pretty big margin. This was amendment number 2, and what it would have done is given authority to set tuition in state colleges to the boards as opposed to the legislature. Louisiana is one of, I believe, only 2 states that allows the legislature to do that, the only state that requires 2/3 vote. And this is something higher ed leaders really pushed for. You know, they've had such cuts in funding, and they're really saying we need the ability to do this to be able to offer the programs to keep us competitive.
And business leaders too were behind
very
it, right?
much so, yes. And but there was kind of a pushback from some advocates for lower income people saying, you know, you're just going to make it more expensive. And I think a lot of voters are so sensitive to this now with what's going on in TOPS that, you know, so that used to be fully funded now is not fully funded anymore. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. The budget continues to be in really bad shape. So the idea of just the specter of raising tuition, I think, got a lot of people's attention. So that was a fail.
And that one failed. And what else failed?
What else failed?
There was the corporate tax one, remember?
That was an interesting one. That was kind of the beginning of tax reform that we're about to embark on. For corporate taxes only, so not that many entities, because a lot of corporations don't file as corporations. But basically, it was the tax rate, which is now graduated, would have been made flat, and in exchange for that, these corporations would have lost their federal tax deduction. And this is something that, again, is considered a very good government move, makes the state more attractive
You bring the rate down, but you take away a big tax break.
You do, and it makes it predictable, and it makes, you know, because all these rating agencies look at tax rates. So Louisiana sometimes gets stuck with the reputation as having high taxes when in fact there are all these deductions. So we get the bad reputation but not the revenue. So,
but that one didn't pass.
But it also did not pass.
That did not pass.
Yeah.
And the one that got the most votes was the one about the veterans and the homestead exemption.
Right, and first responders, surviving spouses of first responders and veterans to have their tax, basically not just homestead, but no property tax.
That's something for lawmakers to remember. If they can word their amendments so it has the words first responder in it, okay, that tends to help.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, Errol, you wanted to touch on the notion of good old boys.
Well, yeah, because you know, we're hearing about the good old boys for years and in campaigns. And this time it was Carolyn Fayard who had a commercial saying the good old boys tried to keep me out of the race. I remember Kathleen Blanco when she ran that, she was talking about it. But it's not just been female candidates. I mean, just across the board for years. First of all, you think by now the good old boys are good old men because people have been talking about them a long time. But I've never heard anybody exactly identify who the good old boys are. Okay. And in the case of Carolyn Fayard, because she was a Democrat, and so she was saying, well, somebody's trying to keep me out so another Democrat can win, then the good old boys must be Democrats. But at the state level, there's not many of them. And I was wondering, like, could it be John Bel Edwards, who was the governor? But if you remember, John Bel Edwards said that when he ran, that Karen Carter Peterson, who's the head of the Democratic Party, and Mary Landrieu talked to him about running for Attorney General. could it be that the good old boys are women? Actually, okay, all right. And then who is it on the Republican side? And the more I thought about it, at first I was kind of thinking about it kind of fancifully, but really what I think, and I'd be interested if you agree, there's really no continuing power base in state politics. Maybe back in the days of the Longs or something,
right.
maybe there were good old boys at that point, that there were people who had this control over elections, but I don't think that exists anymore.
Right.
David
Vitter was kind of setting himself up to try to be
that. David Vitter was probably
but he's
the closest.
now.
I mean, I think it's not elected officials anymore.
Lobbyists.
It's lobbyists, but
yeah.
the trial lawyers, and we say that broadly, but they won the Supreme Court race this cycle. They won the last Supreme Court race. They backed John Bel Edwards.
And speaking of who comes from a line of trial lawyers, Caroline Fayard. So
Back to the good old boys.
yes.
And there were some people who would make an argument about whether or not trial lawyers are really good. I mean, good old boys, all right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're certainly powerful out there. But it's just one of these phrases in politics, and I just wanted to raise the question and to pose the question that they're sort of like political boogeymen, but I don't know if they really exist.
Okay, so we wrap up discussion about this week of politics. An interesting week it was, and it's now time to look ahead. Okay,
this weekend the Sugar Bowl tennis tournament returns after a hiatus of 10 years, and it returns to City Park, and it's going to be a high-level tennis tournament, and it could be the beginning of something big for local tennis.
All right, great. Jeremy.
Planning begins next week for 2 televised U.S. Senate debates. There'll be at least 2. There might be one more as well.
Okay. Tyler?
Well, and speaking of the Senate, that's what I'm covering for the Advocates, to see whether this will actually develop into a competitive race. The initial indications are, as we discussed earlier, is that John Kennedy has such a strong advantage. It'll be very tough for Foster Campbell. So let's see what Foster Campbell can do to try to change that narrative.
All right. Steph?
I'm waiting to see if anybody out there in the national press picks up on the fact that we might actually have another Senator Kennedy, but not a Democrat and not from Massachusetts. So
Talk about a difference from the other Kennedy.
Yeah.
I mean, in just about every way possible.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, and I am going to pitch something too. We're going to have another installment in our Reshaping a Greater New Orleans series, which has looked at recovery efforts post-Katrina. And this one's going to look into changes in healthcare access, particularly with the growing network of community clinics, with the absence of charity. Now it's out there in the neighborhoods. Reshaping a Greater New Orleans, Creating Healthy Communities. It comes up this Thursday at 7. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.